shortly.
Good morning. Today we continue our inquiry on British film and high-end TV, and so far we've heard a lot about film, but today we're very pleased to welcome one of the country's most successful producers of high-end television, Jane Tranter. Thank you so much, Jane, for joining us. Over the past 5 years, spend on high-end TV in the UK has outpaced spending on film. What explains that incredible rise, and what has that meant for you and your business and the work that you do?
I think there's a short-term answer and a slightly longer-term answer to that. The short-term answer really, I think, can be answered very straightforwardly in the words Game of Thrones. I think that Game of Thrones coming to Northern Ireland and settling in the Paint House in Belfast as it did all those years ago really did two things, and I was part of the setup back in the day when I was at the BBC of bringing Game of Thrones into Northern Ireland, and what was being done at that time, but this was in the days before the UK tax credit had been brought in, was placing it in an area where the workforce, the whole creative community there was very strong, but significantly less costly than other areas of the world, and where they could access a tax credit from Ireland. And having a show, a television show, which has film-like production values take place so successfully within the UK was a real turning point. Having one of the most popular television series of that time, indeed of all time, take place with British actors was a turning point for the audience, and it meant that suddenly the inward investment coming into the UK from the US was transformed. The introduction of the tax credit for high-end TV in 2013 then further changed that. So it's the combination of audience demand and US broadcaster commissioner confidence plus the tax credit really changed the face of everything for television.
We've heard that as programme budgets rise, the commissioners and the audiences just expect programmes to look better. They kind of want that sort of cinematic experience on TV. Do you recognise that pressure as a producer of high-end TV? And how do British producers keep up with that demand and live up to it?
I definitely recognise that. To some extent, I built my production company, Bad Wolf, on the back of that. I had lived and worked for 8 years in Los Angeles before returning to the UK, specifically to Wales, to start Bad Wolf. And what I said, my mission then was to make globally programmes for a global audience from Wales using US international co-production, and so to be able to produce on a higher level. And we were, at the time, the only independent production company who actually, probably to some extent still are, who without a US studio or without a US broadcaster making it in-house, we were the only independent production company to do it. So I completely recognise that, and indeed I lent into it. But I think that is a world apart from what has happened around that, which is not about UK independent production companies making things homegrown with a very strong domestic payoff and boost versus productions coming in from outside of the UK, literally helicoptering in, taking advantage of our good crews, taking advantage of our comparatively good rates, bringing their money with them, yes, but then they helicopter out again and have not built any growth. So I think the bringing in of these high budget pieces has skewed our own internal economic ecology within the television industry, and hasn't built for sustainability.
Has it encouraged, and has it sort of almost had a net result of the fact that quite a lot of the programmes that are made here need to appeal to American audiences rather than British ones as well?
To some extent. I mean, I do think that I think Definitely anything which is on the higher budget level, so what we would call a band 3 and specifically a band 4 and above. You can't make that without US funding. It's just not possible. At least it's not to date. I think there are things that we have to start looking at to try and make that possible, so we're not overly reliant on one pool of money. But there are other shows. I mean, if you look at, and most of these come from the BBC, but if you look at things like Normal People or Happy Families or Line of Duty, Call the Midwife, the shows that actually are very important to British audiences, they are made with minimal American investment, and normally that American investment comes at the back end rather than at the front end. But that I think, I'm sure you'll get onto this, but I think that is the big change that we are about to see in our industry as the world has shifted post-COVID and the strikes.
How do you think we go about rebalancing to fill the sort of vacuum that you mentioned, that the sort of big overseas money comes in, does their production, and then goes away again? What's the cure for that?
I think there are two things. The first one is just encouraging more people to think things through in the way we did Bad Wolf. So the idea of starting Bad Wolf in the way that we did, which was with a private-public partnership with the Welsh Government, came to me when I was working in New York. And I was lucky enough to work in New York on and off over an 8-year period. And I worked initially with James Gandolfini and the team that he had built up while working for many, many years on The Sopranos. And the piece I was filming in New York, which initially had James in it before he died, I met his team. And I looked at that team and they reminded me of the crews I'd worked with in Wales. And they reminded me of the crews I worked with in Wales because of their passion, because of their commitment, and because of their dedication to the area that they were working in. The second thing that struck me as really interesting was how intergenerational the jobs were. They were very much passed down from father to son. And I thought, I am from... on my mother's side, intergenerational coal miners, and on my father's side, intergenerational weavers. And until there was no coal mining, until there was no weaving left. And I looked at this and thought, I've never looked at our business like this before. But actually, why can't our business be like this? And in particular, I'd like to see mother to daughter, not just father to son, obviously. But why can't our business be like this? And I thought, well, if they can do it in New York, why can't I do it in the UK? And I had worked previously in Wales when I set up Doctor Who there in 2003, and then briefly when I was in Los Angeles when we went to Swansea and we set Da Vinci's Demons there. And I thought, well, we could set Bad Wolf there. And if I make a commitment, which is very unusual for British independent production companies, if I make a commitment to film in one area, I can create something outside of just making drama. So we can build somewhere which gives people, because we are ruthless about saying we will commit to this nation and we will film all of our studio stuff in this nation only, then we can have jobs 52 weeks a year. So I built All Studios Wales, which I'm sure we'll come on to, and I put a classroom in it in order to start training school children so they could understand. 10 years passes really quickly in our industry, I'm sure it does in everyone's, but before you know it, the kid who's in your classroom age 8 will be looking for a job age 18, so you can't start early enough. And we started to look at a whole different way of making drama, which meant that we had our feet held to the fire by our accountability to supply spend and jobs to the Welsh Government, which we did, and then some, and then some, and then some, and where we could build crews and a creative community in one place. Now, our industry is a very mobile industry, so it's an unusual thing to do. Most people would set up an independent production company with funding from a studio or a broadcaster, and I very deliberately didn't do that because I knew perfectly well that if I had gone to an American studio and said, could you please help me fund Bad Wolf, they'd have said, yes, please use our studios in X, Y, or Z in England. And I wanted the independents to be able to do it differently. I thought that I could see the industry leaving Wales. I could see our opportunity to put some green shoots in there. I'd seen what had happened on the west coast of America with Silicon Valley. If you build it, they will come. Sometimes you need to dream in order to create an industry, and that's what we did. So that's one thing. I think that when you are HQ'd in London and your productions happen all over the UK, you often don't stop and think about your accountability to how many people you're employing, how regularly you're going to employ them. Because when you do a production, it's not just the 3,405 direct employees that Bad Wolf has had over the past few years. What's happening to the hotels? What's happening to the cafes? What's happening to the dry cleaning? What's happening to the newsagents, the florists, the bars, the pubs, everything? And what normally happens is film units come in and they land and they change the town completely, and then they leave and there's a kind of piece of tumbleweed and an empty crisp packet and an empty hotel. And I thought, but if we stay, this will constantly be a churn and it will make a difference. And I think if we can incentivize more people to do what Bad Wolf did, particularly critically outside of the southeast and into the nations and regions, then that will make a huge difference. The second thing is I think we need to look again at the television tax credit. So the television tax credit has been the second most important thing probably that's happened this century for our industry. The most important thing was in 2003 and the terms of trade, creating independent production companies in a different way to how they are elsewhere in the world, which we can come back to if you're interested in that. The second thing was the 2013 UK tax credit, which I loved. But because it hasn't been used, it's just been used as a blanket, that is partly what has encouraged this mass kind of inward investment, which has also been very gratefully received, but it hasn't grown homegrown talent and homegrown shows. And I think we need to look again at the UK tax credit. I think we need to look at it again, one, because it was overlooked in the spring 2024 budget. Film got a very high increase. I think the effective tax relief on film under 15 million now is 39.5 compared to the effective tax relief for TV, which I believe is 25.5. So it's a massive gap. That gap needs to be filled, particularly in light of the comments you made at the start about, the difference in how television is outpacing film in this way. But I think we need to look at increasing the tax credit in a way which directly benefits homegrown domestic pieces. So I think there's two things we could do about that. One is we look at that increase in tax credit, if you were kind enough to give that, to be done only if it has got a homegrown UK entity, whether it's an independent production company or whether it's in-house at a broadcaster. For you, I'm not kind of like just touting my own business here, but I think it needs to be given to someone who is living and working in the UK with a responsibility for supplying jobs and growth and basic levelling up in exchange for getting that tax credit. So you put stronger guidelines on. And secondly, I think that to your point about how we manage without the US inward investment being so fluent as once it was, I think we need to look at some of the lower end shows, in particular the Band 2 type shows, which actually don't attract, they're too UK focused to really attract any inward investment, and they are becoming increasingly difficult to make because budgets are increasing because of that US inward investment. And yet the broadcasters' licence fees are not increasing because the BBC licence fee isn't increasing, ITV ad spend isn't increasing. So it's got a bit out of whack. So I think protection for those lower cost shows in the same way that my colleagues excellently got for the 15 mil and under films in the UK would be really helpful. One, and two, protection so that you have to ensure that it can't just be that a US studio flies a production in and there isn't someone who is invested in the area like Bad Wolf or other production companies who will be there saying that's all very well, but I want to build a classroom, I want to train, I want to level up. Are you employing the right people? Are you in the right areas of the country so we're not all focused in England?
Brilliant. I love the thing about skills in the classroom in the studio, but we might come back to that in a minute. But before we do, can I move on to Clive, please?
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? Just an observation, really. It was an absolutely wonderful sort of story that you set out about what you did, and to make it, to embed it in a community rather than fly in and fly out. One of the things that strikes me when I'm a governor of a secondary school which does T levels now and has done BTECs and things, and those young people are looking for places.
Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room.
That can employ those young people, but it just strikes me that constantly there's a gap between what education is trying to do, and it's trying to do the right thing.
Yes. And
the industry that then turn around and say, well, we haven't got kids coming out of schools with the right skills. And did you succeed in marrying that up in what you were doing?
So we, I mean, that was a huge thing that we did. So again, one of the things in the 2003 whole kind of like bill that came out, there was a whole kind of like emphasis on screen skills. And they were areas that would cope with things like that were put all across the country. A lot of them are now being closed. I think there's only 6 remaining, and critically there isn't one in Wales. There isn't one in Scotland. The one in Scotland's closed. The one in Manchester's closed. They're mainly crowded in the southeast. So we started something called Screen Alliance Wales, which Bad Wolf did as a sort of philanthropic thing, which again we did in association with the Welsh Government, and we got other sponsors. Most of the broadcasters who, like HBO or the BBC, who work with us, we got them to invest money into Screen Alliance Wales. And through Screen Alliance Wales, who run our classroom in the studio, they also get out into classrooms around Wales. So I think we've had, in the time we've been doing this, we've had something like in the region of 52,000 engagements with local students, kids, and indeed adults, because it's not just kids who sometimes need, training and to find the right entry point. We've had 117 trainee positions and 405 work placements. And what we do there is we use Screen Alliance Wales to help create that bridge in between finishing school and thinking, I'm not really quite sure what to do, and getting into the industry. This is something I feel really passionate about. I always say, I look very different today than when I did when I started, because the years in the industry change you. But I knew nothing and nobody when I started. And indeed, I came from Methodist working class family who thought TV was bad for you. So it was kind of like, it's quite a journey to battle your way through. And I think still sometimes television, even doesn't matter how much you teach it in schools, it still can seem a bit smoke and mirrors when you think, how do I get a job? And one of the things Screen Alliance Wales does is it goes around to the schools and it says, do you think you'd like to have a job in TV? And everyone goes, no, I couldn't do that. And they go, okay, let me ask you a question. Who likes cooking? Put your hand up. Keep your hand up. Who likes geography? Keep your hand up. You can do locations. You can do location catering. Who likes making things? Put your hand up. You can be a chippy. Who's interested in physics? Put your hand up. You can be an electrician. And so it goes round until there's very rarely a kid left. And believe me, we always make sure there is never a kid left with their hand down. And they think, okay, it's not, working in television is not just about being in front of the camera or immediately behind the camera. We've got to put the industry back into creative industry and really focus on what it is that, the great group of people that work together to make us creative. So that direct engagement in schools is one thing, but the other thing that SOAR do is we go in and we work with the University of South Wales. We take a lot, because it's on our doorstep, we take a lot of people who come in, and particularly for a lot of the digital work that we do, they have excellent schemes there. And we bring them in either directly into Bad Wolf or via Painting Practice, which is homed in Wool Studios Wales. But we never expect anyone to come out fully trained. That I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in what degree someone done. In fact, I'm would encourage people to some extent these days not even to get a degree unless it's a passion for them. what I'm interested in is their commitment, their conviction, their passion, their enthusiasm, their work ethic, and we will train them. We will give them that time, and we can do that because we're in one area and we're lucky enough to have a studio in which we can base that training from.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'll get back to what I was supposed to ask now. But no, sorry, it was me. So last year, inward investment on high-end television was 51% lower than in 2022, and the Welsh Government is saying that they're getting fewer inquiries.
Yeah.
So how do you account for that drop in inward investment?
Again, short-term answer. I think that after COVID, obviously everything stopped. When COVID kind of like lifted and people began to come back, we had a big boom, and it was a false boom. And that boom was about the productions that had been paused through COVID being started again, and then there was still a level of new things coming in, and that created a big kind of burst. And there was a time post-COVID where actually, rates just mushroomed, and it actually meant that a lot of UK-based companies were finding it difficult to get the budgets to work. And indeed, there was also, these are good problems in some ways, but you couldn't even get your camera equipment hired or your lighting equipment hired sometimes because there were so many people descended on the UK to start filming. Then there were the strikes. So we had COVID, which actually still carried its wound with it, even though it looked like it was a boom. It wasn't. That was very, very fragile. That was never going to hold. And then on top of the wound of COVID, we had the wound of 2 strikes. And the result of that is that the US began to change their strategy. They became more cautious. They had been hit not only by the loss of production during the strike, but the economic changes that the strikes, in a good way, have brought about. And they have begun to not want to do so many UK co-productions as once they had, but rather kind of huddle their money into a sort of fewer, bigger, better kind of approach. At the same time, we've had this big boom in the streaming services, and that's beginning to just sort of sort itself out a bit. We've seen recently a lot of kind of like withdrawing in of some of the streaming services. There've been a lot of job losses. There've been budget cuts. And I think what it's done is it's just made the UK industry very aware of how reliant it's become on inward investment. And how it wasn't always that way.
Are we too reliant?
I think that, again, I've built Bad Wolf on being reliant on inward investment, but I need to balance that out now, which is what, the whole team, I'm only sitting here, but there could be loads of people here from Bad Wolf who would be saying the same things. We need to look and rebalance it a bit and not be concentrating so much on only the higher end shows. But I think it goes back to the point I'm making that I think when we do have the opportunity for large amounts of inward investment, we have to ensure that inward investment comes totally linked to some form of UK-based independent producer or production company, so that they in turn can ensure that there are benefits of making that piece in the UK tied to the local areas. The rest of it is basically, it just is what it is. It's the same as in film. You want to make a project, you go around and you have to find the funding for it, and you shift the budget accordingly. It's become much harder, but you just have to try harder.
So what would help to grow domestic investment in high-end?
The regulation of the tax credit I spoke about.
But is there anything else? Because we're being told that that's becoming a highly competitive area. Lots of governments are now cutting taxes. So is it going to be an ever downward spiral? Is it just a war in terms of tax credits, or are there other things that we can offer?
I don't think the UK should be competing elsewhere in the world for tax credits. I think the UK has to sort out what is going to be the best tax credit it can get in order to grow its domestic film and TV. And the recent budget did that to some extent for the very hard to fund 50 million and under film. It needs to do the same thing for television. Television just somehow its voice got lost in that spring 2024 budget, and we need to amend that. That is one thing. And then I think we need to be encouraging, more sustainability in order to be able to stop the industry being quite so relentlessly mobile, which means that you don't have a chance to grow teams around you who are loyal to the nation and what you're doing, who can deliver high quality productions cost effectively based on training and experience.
Yeah, the last question, just to add to that, you talked a lot about training people and giving them the skills. Do we have enough skilled technicians to attract that?
No, we don't have enough, and that's when, again, as I said, it's a shame because in 2003 there were many, when the whole kind of like screen skills initiative was set up, there was a lot of those, and now there isn't, which is why there's Screen Alliance Wales, which Bad Wolf has been privileged and fortunate enough to be able to start. But actually those are things which government could happily do. There are a lot of skills based in the southeast of England. We need to push it out, and we need to look at training in those areas where actually there are many people who would perhaps welcome the opportunity to work in this way, but who haven't got the training initiatives. It can't just be within schools, although that is good. As you yourself point out, what happens after school? Mm. And that's what we need to be looking at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. Rupert.
Yeah, I wanted to turn to AI. I mean, as politicians, we worry the next election, deep fakes and all this stuff. Does Bad Wolf have a policy on using artificial intelligence in making programmes?
Bad Wolf has used some artificial intelligence, but we do it only in the area of kind of virtual and digital production. So when we are doing things digitally, that is about effects and landscapes only. It would never, ever be in relation to an artist or a piece of writing or anything like that. So we're very strict on that, and actually even if we weren't, we would be held, our feet would be held to the fire, because the artists' agents, obviously following all the highlighting of this in the recent SAG strike and the WGA strike, our agents here are very up on all of that. So we will use AI in the way that any industry would use AI when we feel that it creates a significant benefit, but not when it is any form of replacement for anything which is creative. Yeah, we're very strong on that.
I mean, BBC guidance says that AI should never undermine the trust of audience. Is that sort of impossible to maintain?
This is just, I am so not an expert on this subject, but I think that the word, the AI initials bring with it a kind of a sense of received fear or received mistrust. I am sure that the BBC are using AI in areas that I'm sure you guys are using it in terms of admin or things which will make life easier and more efficient for people. The BBC are not using AI in the same way that Bad Wolf are not using AI.
And you talked about the strikes and the fact AI was so central to those. I mean, partly as a result of that, they've got quite highly developed union agreements now. When you do these co-productions, which I must say, sometimes even they themselves, the weird, something like Sex Education or Saltburn, it looks like a weird Americanized English version of a school. But anyway, you've still got Doctor Who, which is so quintessentially British. When you do these co-productions, is it the American regs that dominate, or are we exempt because it's made in the UK?
It's the UK because of the 2003 Terms of Trade. Everything we do is run through our UK regs and contracts. We very rarely employ anyone under an American contract. We have something called a SAG waiver, for example, where we might employ American actors, but that contract is waived just for that one specific job. So we are lucky in that we can protect ourselves from that. I'm just going to say very quickly, because this is just me being interested in these things, but something like sex education, for example, that wasn't actually a co-pro. That was actually something that was made quite low budget to start off with. The fact that they made it look like an American high school was an artistic choice. And actually kind of pay. I don't know why I'm defending sex ed, to be clear, it's not my show, but it's interesting because what you're picking up on is an artistic choice. And 11, a very successful UK independent production company, and they shot sex ed in Wales, hurrah, although 11 aren't based in Wales. 11 made that choice because they thought it would appeal to an audience, which links to your point perhaps about, is there so much Americanization in the pieces that we do that audiences sort of expect it? I personally don't think that is right, nor do I think with the streaming services is that something we should fuss over. Audiences can make the choices that they make, but what I do think we need to do is protect the right of companies like 11 to be able to afford to make sex ed, which is not an expensive show. And it would be difficult to fund today. Obviously, sex ed has been...
At least it wasn't in Transylvania, because even a lot of these Bollywood films were made in Eastern Europe, but they pretend it's... They superimpose Big Ben or something in there.
Yeah.
Okay, last one from me. I mean, we've all seen the doctored royal photos this week. Just wanted to ask about post-production. When the director, James Hawes, gave evidence, he said that AI can change performances in the edit room. Would you have concerns about... I mean, I think you said you have some degree of it.
I just don't know why you would use AI to change performances in the edit room. I just wouldn't do that, because actually you can change performances in the edit room. You can tell the story in the edit room. It's where the script is continuing to be written in the edit when you look at what you shot. I don't know why you would want to change performances. I think maybe one of the things James might have been talking about was his work on Andor, where there was a lot of kind of like digital effects work and maybe enhancement of people who weren't always kind of like human or whatever. And it might be he was talking about that, but I have never used AI in an edit so far.
Would you agree with the sort of having more protections like they do in America? Should we tighten those things up?
I'm not sure that we have any less protections here than we do in America. I just think that was a subject that was put under a spotlight because those unions quite properly, were concerned and brought it out in terms of the, use of image or use of AI to write a script or whatever. And I kind of like, why would you do that? Why would you not want actors to create that from their human hearts and soul? And why would you not want a writer's voice to be heard? So I'm not there, but I do love a visual effect, and I do love to use a volume wall. And if AI helps me with the digital effects and volume wall, bring it on. But it stops there. It stops there.
It'd be an improvement on the old Doctor Who that looked like a toilet roll or whatever.
Definitely.
Okay,
I preferred it when Daleks couldn't do stairs myself.
Don't forget, they are the most malevolent, malign force in the whole universe,
yes,
so be careful of who you know. They are well-known visitors to the Houses of Parliament, we know that.
Thank you very much, Rupert. Let's move to Simon, please.
All the DVDs to prove it. Jane, really interesting evidence so far this morning. Thank you so much for coming in. I want to talk about skills. I represent a constituency in the southwest of England. I look at what you've done and what the industry has done in South Wales with enviable eyes. Finding that specific talent, that production talent that you need in different nations and regions, it is difficult. How have you built that talent up in South Wales?
Well, to some extent it was already there. I always said with Wales, the talent was there, but it just hadn't been given the opportunity. Or the talent was there and had crossed the border to go and get a chance somewhere else, or it was just hiding. And we did it, really. We did it through His Dark Materials, which was, at the time, the biggest actually, I think it still is the biggest fully fledged independent production company that has been made in the UK, and we just grew it. We had a vision. So we, alongside of thinking, all right, how are we going to make His Dark Materials, which is a phenomenally complicated production, and had kids in the lead, and they need protection. You just can't take them out to the North Pole and kind of say go up that mountain and shoot a tragic scene. You have to, look after them. You're working within restricted hours. And so that's when we had the idea of, we actioned the building of Wool Studio Wales. So we could have a studio in which we could house a community of people that would grow together. And that's what we did, and we started off with a small group of people. There were, about 3 of us, myself, Dan McCulloch and Joel Collins, worked together to create a community around us on His Dark Materials that was a community within Wales. And we opened prop stores, and we opened costumes department, and we had makers, and we had painters, and we just did all of it. And while all of that was happening, I then had to find the next show, and the next show, and the next show. So when we were building out Wool Studio Wales, it was a bit like, doing a house. We could only afford to do 1 floor at a time, and you lived in, the dust and the rubble for the rest of it. And gradually, we're able to open another stage and another stage as the productions grew bigger. Until eventually, we've ended up hundreds and hundreds of screen hours later, and having spent £584 million in the UK through our production spend, we ended up being able to justify 7 stages in Wool Studio Wales. The important thing, and I really think that was a critical part of how we did what we did and how we grew those skills, because having made a commitment, we don't own Wool Studio Wales, the Welsh Government own that, we have a lease with it. I think it is the only studio that exists anywhere in the world that was not built by property developers, and it was not built for profit. It was built by producers who wanted to build it to make the most cost-effective productions that they could inside it, and create a large environment to grow that community and to train for those skills in a way that would also allow us to create a working community. Our industry sometimes isn't an easy one to work in, and I think when you're very mobile, it's often it's often hard to look for how you create a working community with fairness and ethos. How are you genuinely levelling up? How are you genuinely leaning into employing people, socio-economic diversity, which is something we do specifically where we are in Wales, and giving them the time to train them and come through. And you can do that because you're in one place. There's no reason why you can't do that in the Southwest, no reason at all. It will just mean that, I would not have been able to do what I did in Wales without a public-private partnership with the Welsh Government, because I would, as I said earlier, I would have been buffeted to go to Leavesden or buffeted to go to Pinewood or whatever, instead of being where I was and really being held extremely accountable in a way that I wanted and enjoyed, because I started a production company later in my career than lots of people do. I'd taken a byway in America and a byway through being a commissioner of drama at the BBC. And I wanted to do something other than just set up a production company. I wanted to have all of this stuff outside of it. But I'm not the only person. I'm just the only one who's done it so far. But you could do that. You've got, I think, the bottle, I don't know, Bristol's in, no, I don't think it is. Actually, you're further into the southwest, aren't you?
As far as you can go, almost. I get what you're saying. And in terms of the industry and talent pipeline, I see colleges locally in my area doing, different media production courses and stuff like that. What more could be done in different regions to encourage this talent to flourish? Because an awful lot of people that I went to college with, 20 odd years ago, were interested in going into TV production, but now work in finance because they just couldn't find job opportunities.
Well, there's plenty of finance needed in TV production. Yes. We have loads of accountants. It goes back to my thing of, if you want to do it, there are the jobs there. You know, it has a very, very broad range of jobs. But it goes back to what I was saying initially about, I don't know why all of those sort of screen skills initiatives that were set up in 2000, I don't know where they've gone and why. And I'm sure I probably should, but I just don't know what's happened and why. But that's what you need. We set up Screen Alliance Wales, which has been the single biggest driver of training, apprenticeships, work placements, not just for Bad Wolf. We do this across everyone. It happens to be housed in Wool Studios, and Bad Wolf happens to we started it and we, you know, fund a great chunk of it. But it's not for Bad Wolf, it's for anyone who comes into Wales. And that's, you need to look at that. And then you need to start thinking about the tax credit and how the tax credit can be specifically used to influence growth in the further flung areas of the UK, so the southwest as well as Wales.
You talked about how the Welsh government have been very supportive. Have you ever tried to do a production where there's been resistance from a local authority in England or elsewhere in the nations and regions?
Well, I think, goodness, I mean, I've only ever worked really in Wales and abroad and a tiny bit just outside London since 2015. I think that most areas are really glad to have a film crew in because it brings so much money with it. I think the the Welsh government, obviously, it has one relationship with Bad Wolf, and then it has other relationships with travelling productions that come in and out. For me, the most sustainable form of investment is to get an area, to get people like ourselves to go into an area and stay and hold them accountable, as opposed to, oh, Disney are bringing a show in, let's give them an incentive to come and do it. Because Disney come in, they film it for one season and then they go. You know, Lord of the Rings is battered all over the world. You know, but His Dark Materials didn't. You know, Discovery of Witches didn't. Industry hasn't. You know, Doctor Who, we've really secured, you know, in it now with its increased investment. And we've absolutely secured that in Wales.
Thank you.
Thank you. John?
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you so much for your testimony. A lot of it has really struck a chord. I loved your line when you said, when I started I knew nothing and I knew nobody, Methodist, and I thought TV was bad for you. I can so relate to that. I remember with a family from the Outer Hebrides being told that you can't watch TV on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Yes.
Or whistle.
Yes.
Or cut papers, or cut your toenails. That was a big thing. No toenail cutting.
No, I think that is.
Sabbath.
I think that's just you and your family. The toenails. I've never heard of that. I just, yeah. Thank you for sharing, but no.
I can tell that you just had one look at me and realised what an odd family I've come from. It's a miracle I'm as normal as I am, to tell you the truth. But yes. But you also talked about self-confidence, and as somebody who entered TV myself and youth television, Janet Street Porter's youth television, I think what I was struck with, first generation to go to university, no background in TV, was just how self-confident so many of my contemporaries, especially Oxbridge people, were. You know, you'd go into meetings and you'd listen to people pontificate who were just my age with this incredible self-confidence, and I'd sometimes think to myself, that was a very obvious thing that they said, but they said it with such, such self-assurance. I don't think I would ever put up my hand to say that, because I just have thought, you know, it's obvious. Did you find that?
Yes, for sure. As I said, I was very different then.
What do you think the big differences are?
Well, at the time, you know, I didn't have the self-confidence, but I knew I wanted to work in stories, and I wanted to work in television. I mean, maybe partly because I hadn't always been allowed to watch whatever I watch. But it's interesting to me that, you know, I went in as a woman. I went in, and as un-Oxbridge educated, I went in as a secretary. Now, I'm really glad I did. That suited me.
It must be an almost unique trajectory, isn't it, from secretary to where you are now? Not because of lack of talent. So many people have talent, or even ambition, but there's a lot of snobbery in the industry, isn't there?
Well, it's changed a lot, but all I would say is that, I wasn't... The women, there were a small handful of women. Verity Lambert, went in as a secretary and ended up as Verity Lambert. It's amazing. And I was very lucky in that I was very gritty. Being a secretary enabled me, and I say this to people today, go in as an assistant, go in as a runner, go in as a receptionist and look around. Work very hard to be the best secretary, assistant, runner, receptionist that you can, and hide your intent while you're looking around and seeing how the industry works.
Hide your
intent as to what you want to do next. Because,
be modest.
Yeah, because nobody wants someone going in as the receptionist and going, but actually really what I want to do is direct. It's kind of like, okay, but could you please let me in with a smile on your face, and take... That's a lot of what we do today at Bad Wolf, is ensure that, there is no one who goes in who is, as I was, one of the very few women, one of the very few people who wasn't Oxbridge educated. But I was very lucky, because in those days, the BBC had a very strong training system.
I remember.
And I was given an attachment as a trainee assistant floor manager. Nowadays that would be called a second assistant director. And I got out from behind the desk after a couple of years, and I got onto the production floor, and I was allowed to work my way up and through. And for me, that kind of the sort of gradual lack of confidence perhaps in what the BBC can offer for us has been a critical part in how training has changed in the UK, hence us having to do those things for ourselves, because those training courses aren't offered anymore, and I was very lucky. But going back, not looking back on it as it was when I was young, but looking at it as it is for young people today, I do think that there is a certain amount of confidence that a youngster needs to have going into our industry, but indeed any industry. I think it's very, very tough for young people today.
I'm getting a lot of messages from people, because we've got the Director General of the BBC before us tomorrow, and what a lot of people are saying is that they're feeling very insecure because they're freelancers and there's long gaps between contracts. And what they're saying is they're not given enough support. And if you come from a working class background in particular, you don't have the financial wherewithal that some folk who come from middle class backgrounds have to sustain those periods of unemployment. And also the other problem is that there's still this issue of people being given job experience, which is unpaid. Again, if your parents can look after you during that period, fine. But if you don't come from that background, you can't afford to work for nothing or almost nothing.
Yeah, so I go back, and I'm sorry, I am like a stock record, so I go back to Bad Wolf's experience with Wolf Studios Wales. In that, because you might get a contract on one production, and people are employed production by production. That is the way it goes. But if you are in one place, one production finishes and another one starts, and our crew move. They move upwards through the ranks of the crew because they have their own form of training, because we are constantly filming 52 weeks a year, because we're in one area and we run a number of productions through that one area at one time, so we can do that, is one thing. The second thing is, I think we have to remember that our television industry, we have worked hard, and again, if you've got your production company in this way, you can absolutely put your foot down and say, right, we need to be the most inclusive that we can be, because there are lots of people who make massively brilliant contributions to our industry who come from the poorest of backgrounds, but we need to find a way in, have all sorts of different forms of neurodiversity, and therefore have all sorts of different ways of approaching people or a problem or piece of creativity or whatever it is. Our industry needs to be as inclusive as it possibly can, from the bottom up, from the top down and the middle out, Because if we don't do that, we won't be able to reflect those stories of all of our lives properly on screen. And if we get that right, we will build the confidence of people. It wasn't inclusive when you and I first started out.
It certainly wasn't, and as a gay man coming out as a TV presenter, I can tell you just how hostile.
Very hard, I can imagine.
Just how hostile and angry the bosses were, which wasn't at all my experience with viewers who were. Well, the programme I was working on, the viewing figures went up. I wanted to ask you about Channel 4, because a lot of people in the industry say that they're very keen, Screen Scotland says this, to increase the out-of-England quota to 16% to reflect populations. Now, what do you think? What difference would that make to the industry? Because I get the sense from Channel 4 bosses, and we had a witness before us who really couldn't answer the question effectively, I didn't think. The implication seems to be that the talent isn't there, which is why they can't...
That's just bollocks.
Well, I agree with you completely, but that's, I think, what their position is. Why are they failing, do you think, watching it as you do so closely, why are they failing to get that quota up to a fair percentage of the UK population in our two nations?
Because I just don't think they're giving it the opportunities. I've spoken about this before. Sometimes when I'm asked, why did you put Doctor Who into Wales? When I was controller of drama at the BBC and I brought back Doctor Who in 2005, and I'm often asked, why did you put it into Wales? And I put it into Wales for three reasons, really. One was because Russell T Davies was Welsh, and although he was living in Manchester, I thought, well, I'm either going to make it in Manchester or I'm going to make it in London. I didn't see the point in making it in London. We were making lots of other things in London. Why would you do that? So then I thought we'll make it in Manchester. Then I had a quota that I had to fill at the BBC for what I needed to make in Wales, and I thought actually Doctor Who would be helpful for that.
You didn't want to do lift and shift?
No. And then I thought, well, this is my emotional response, but I felt that, one of the things that had been with Wales, Scotland was doing very well at the time. We had Monica the Glen, we had Hamish Macbeth. It actually, Scotland, felt that it was on a bit of a roll, but it's proof that actually you can't rely on these things. You have to constantly, it's not one production is going to fix it. You have to constantly, it's sustainable. You have to constantly kind of like be working to get a proper production powerhouse bedded in. But I have autistic children, and in my view, who are often considered to be problem children, I think they are the best children in the world. I think they are magnificent. I think the problem child is the child that we all ought to be keeping our eyes on. The problem child are often, if they are a problem, and then I think that they might be a problem because they're unloved, and that makes them seem unlovely. And emotionally, I felt that Wales felt unloved, and therefore it had become unlovely. They just hadn't had the opportunities to make what it needed to make. And so I said to Russell T Davies and Julie Gardner, if we got Doctor Who's going to be in a studio somewhere, if we build a studio in Wales, what do you think? And they were both Welsh, and they were kind of like, great, let's go for it. And everybody was there. Everybody was there, and everyone still is there. They are there in Scotland. They are there in Northern Ireland. They are there in the southwest of England. You just need to put a focus on them, give it a bit of time, because it does take time, and hold people accountable to stay. And you can't have people go in and out for a quick buck, whether it's British producers or American producers or any producer for outside. You have to hold people accountable and stay. And you have to change the rates on the studios. Sorry, I have to say this before I forget, that Wolf Studios is really important to housing. All of the things we do in Bad Wolf, the valuation office, the rates on studio, warehouses being used as studios has massively increased. The spring 2024 budget gave a nice 40% relief to studios in England. Valuations office doesn't count in Scotland or Northern Ireland, so it's only Wales that's been left out, which means that my rates in Wolf Studios Wales have had a 272% increase, which is the equivalent of 3.4 million over 4 years, and it will put the studio out of business. I think it was just an oversight. I think, I think the television got sort of left off the looking at the tax credit again in the spring 2024 budget. Thank you for film, but television got left off. I think that Wales got left off by the relief offered to studios in England, which means that all the big studios, the Pinewood, the Leavesden, all of those really, really big earners have relief. And what we're doing in Wolf Studios Wales will be under significant threat unless we can get some help in that.
Thank you. A metaphor for Wales and the Union, I suspect. Back to you, Chair.
We'll come on and talk about the studios with Damien in a minute, but beforehand, can we move to Giles, please?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for your evidence today, Jane. It's really fascinating. And moving on from some of your questions that John Nicholson gave you just now, about the development of kind of why you chose Wales, etc. I kind of get that now. But when you went in as you said earlier, a small group, and you started this development, this incredible studio complex, did you import people in? Because as we all know, it's largely freelance, and a great film editor can come from Glasgow, London, wherever. Did you import people in, or did you make a deliberate effort to grow local talent?
So we obviously made a deliberate policy of growing local talent, and when it wasn't there, we trained for it so that it would be there in years to come. So something like His Dark Materials, for example, took, I can't remember if it was 5 or 7 years to make the 3 series. We were in, I think it may have been 7 years in total, from sort of beginning reading the book and thinking we'll do it to the end. So it gives you a chance to train for it. It was a mixture of things, really. We had, so we brought in, for example, Joel Collins to do the production design, to be the production designer on His Dark Materials, because he'd come from Black Mirror and he had that level.
Of course, because of your experience here in the BBC and in America and so forth, you will have worked with some of the great people, and you'd want to bring those people. Yeah,
so I brought him in, but he then brought in a Welsh design team and Welsh construction company Forward that we grew. A lot of those SMEs grew around what we did, you know, the people who built the sets, the people who supplied us with the scaffolding. So you might bring in a few people in order to guarantee that this show is going to be made, but then you work and you train, and then the next time round you don't need to bring so many people in, and the next time round you don't need to bring any people in. But the three of us, Joel, Dan and myself, we had a vision as to what we could go to do. The only thing we haven't achieved in that is I had this vision that actually we were going to have a small farmers market outside the studio. If you come and look outside the studio now, you'll see no farmers market, but a massive basically place where what we call the villagers part, where all the makeup trucks and everything like that is. We became much bigger than I had ever thought we would. So the farmers market is still to come.
And your presence has regenerated an entire chunk of Cardiff, I would imagine, and you've seen that effect.
I think, you know, there is sometimes, you know, it is that sort of, you know, Victorian rail worker, you build them and, you know, you build it and people will come. And so there has been a big regeneration, and we did put Wales under the spotlight and said, listen, this is what people can do here.
You just mentioned your vision, and that fascinates me. As a very young man, I was 21 years old when I took on the production of a theatre. I had no clue what I was doing, but the plan sort of evolved. Did you come in with a plan?
No, I came in with...
Or did it grow as you went?
I came in with an instinct and a vision. I knew I wanted to make His Dark Materials. I knew I probably had to have a studio to do that. I had taken my work in studios in New York and I brought that over. And I had people around me who helped me. Often people said I was crazy. I mean, literally, and they probably are true, but at least I can cut my toenails on the Sabbath, so I'm not that crazy. But I just said, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to do, and I believe. And sometimes you just need to do that leap of faith. And then you do have to, you know, I think having that private public partnership with the Welsh Government meant I had to run it really, really strongly as a business. I had to account for every job. I had to look at everything, every pound of spend that we were doing. So you can't waft your way through anything. Not that you can, really. Our industry's too hard for that. But it meant I had to grow it in a particular way.
Did you have to get business advice on this? Because nobody's sort of born...
I did have... I had... Honestly, I cannot tell you how much advice I had, and I cannot tell you how much I would just sit in a room, talk about these things, and everyone else would go out and do it. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I'm the spokesperson for it, and proudly so. But it's so much the work and advice and input of other people. What I did was the one who kept saying, the top of the mountain is nearby. Come on, everybody.
And keep that vision strong.
Yeah.
I just want to talk briefly about the people, about the freelancers that we all know that work in the business. We know that the hours can be incredibly long. And there have been accusations over the years about bullying, etc. And we also know that there's a skills crisis because people are leaving the industry, which I understand throughout COVID, because people went off to make a living. They're freelancers. They had to do something. But now we're post-COVID. Why are they leaving the industry? Is it because of business practices?
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. I don't think we have a skills crisis as much as a retention crisis and a sustainability crisis. I think that is partly about the mobility of our industry, which again is why we're very lucky that, if we're based in one area and we film mainly in Wales, when we go out and we're not filming in Wales and we're travelling, it's the minority rather than the majority. So it means people can work from home, which is a huge thing. We also have, I am incredibly strict that we have 5-day weeks. I always say I want to get everyone safely home to their families on a Friday night, and I want to bring them safely back to work on a Monday, no matter where they live in Wales or Cardiff or elsewhere in the UK, whatever it is.
That's a mental health thing then.
It is. I think the retention, I think for me, this is the next thing, probably more than AI, but that might just be because I'm not bright enough to see further. For me, the next thing is actually looking at our working practices, because filming days are long, because you're often chasing the light. Yeah. And although they're regulated and anything outside of that is overtime, they are long. People are often... if you're on camera at 8, people are in costume and makeup often from 5. Yeah. So how we do that is a real issue, because if you shorten the days, you up the production budget.
Hugely. Yeah.
But I do think that how our industry looks at mental health, whether it's about retaining people or not, it is just for the good of the people we're employing, is really the next big thing, for sure.
And it also has to be remembered that we live in a very damp climate, and you have to grab every moment of dryness during the day's shoot. So that's why you have to be up.
Know that very well, yes.
Absolutely. So one final question. You mentioned earlier inward investment and American investment being very important and a very large part of the industry. Does that make it easier or harder for producers to improve the working culture?
Well, if you're an independent, the working culture is your own. So you are responsible for that.
Where the money comes from?
Well, no, your working culture, because the money comes in to the independent production company, but how you are setting that up, you are working in the UK through the UK terms of trade, through the UK pact equity contracts, however it is. Writers Guild of Direct Britain, Directors Guild of Great Britain. So we work in that way.
But you don't get under undue pressure, you would say, from foreign investment.
No. In fact, in terms
to deliver at a certain date, etc., etc.
Well, you do. You work it through with them. Often in some ways, the Americans are better at that in some ways than our British broadcasters, because they've got that little bit more yield in their budgets. HBO, for instance, a lot of Bad Wolf is we got one of the best kind of every health and safety policy, every piece of human resources. We're really kind of big on all of that. And we've got a lot of those. We have made improvements because we've looked at what HBO or what Disney Plus do, for example, and we've taken the best of it. I don't find any sense of them saying, come on, cut corners, or anything like that. Nor do I think you can cut corners in those sorts of things in filming. You do that at your peril. But I like our Bad Wolf HQ is in Wolf Studios Wales, which means I can see what's going on around me all the time, and you can keep an eye on it. It's not a film unit that's happening miles and miles and miles away, and often you're thinking, well, what are they doing?
Centralised things. Just final. In 20 minutes, I'm going to be asking the Chancellor a question, and my question is going to be on tax breaks. I think, for our cultural offer. What would you ask the Chancellor?
I would ask the Chancellor to consider the television tax credit improving in the same way that the film tax credit has improved. So it needs to go up by the same percentage. I would ask the Chancellor to look at improving beyond that for UK independent production companies. So if an American production wants to come in, they will only get an enhanced tax credit if they are working with a UK independent production company, which is there in order to ensure that all that other good stuff is done around it. So it's not just flying in, flying out. I would ask the Chancellor to look more favourably on those outside of South East England. I'm very careful not to say all of England because of our other friends here, but in particular the nations and the regions. And I would look at the Chancellor to look favourably on the slightly lower level UK shows, the Band 2 shows, where we don't get as much US money.
Sadly, I don't think the Speaker would let me ask all that.
Well, I think to put it more simply then, I would say that I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. And I think it's not just a glob of, okay, here's a tax credit, because it could benefit in the wrong way. You've got to think about the nations and regions if you want to level up.
Tailor it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Giles. Let's go to Damien, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning and welcome. I'm delighted to hear what you're doing about the diversity of entry into Bad Wolf. I like to think things have improved since I started at the BBC, where I was on a journalist training course which had 6 people on it, and there was diversity there. And only 5 of us were straight out of Oxford.
Oh, there we go.
There was somebody there from Sussex as well.
Yeah.
I hope the BBC may have got slightly more sensitive in that area since then. But I want to return to the business rate relief. I've been frantically Googling whether the valuation office agencies was a devolved body, but it doesn't seem to be. So this is just Wales has been left out rather than it's for the Welsh government.
I think it's a mistake, she said generously, because maybe there was an assumption that it was devolved. And I mean, I get very confused, to be honest, about what is devolved and what isn't. So immediately it happened, obviously went straight to Dawn Bowden and said, oi, and she said this one is not devolved. So obviously it's a critical thing for me to raise here, because although it seems like a separate thing, I've made Bad Wolf have a 360-degree business and production model in order to be able to do the things that we do outside of just making the productions, and that is being endangered by the increase in the rates.
And it specifically hits you, doesn't it?
It specifically hits Wales. And specifically, it's not just Wolf Studios Wales. There is Saren, there is Dragon Studios, but they don't do what we do. They are more, well, come in and film, everyone welcome. We're the only one who's got a production company that lives in the studio and pushes all of its production through that studio, so we can do all the other good stuff around just making the productions.
And have you been in contact with the Welsh government? So that
yes,
they can
I've spoken to Dawn about it, and obviously, we've been when the rates thing came out, I think it was April 2023. It first kind of appeared, and we've obviously, it will put us out of business. because we will never, ever cover. I think we worked out it will be an additional 3.4 million over 4 years. Now, that's huge in our business of renting a studio. You remember, Wool Studio Wales, we're not property developers, we're not looking for big money. We are there trying to make our productions work in a home where people can come to 52 weeks a year. So it's a slightly different model, and that will crush us. And I don't see why would Wales be left out? And there was something, if I'm honest, where, in the last budget, it was kind of, okay, this is good for film, 15 million and under, with film agencies based in London, and it's good for England because of the studios. But if you're TV and you've got a studio in Wales, it's really bad.
Yeah. As you say, let's hope it was a mistake that can be.
I think both those things were just. I think and then I said to Adrian on the way, and I think they lobbied really well and very effectively, and their voices will be heard. And people like me were sitting in a shed in Wales, and our voices were not heard. So that's on us as much as anyone else. But I've got a voice now, and this is the question to ask.
Okay.
You're using it beautifully, by the way. We're all making furious notes.
I think you've convinced us. Yeah. And just one follow-up really is, what else would you like to see the UK government or the public service broadcasters do to grow a studio infrastructure outside the traditional area in the southeast?
I think that more of the public-private partnership that we've benefited from in Wales, I would encourage people to look at that. I think that the BBC needs to be taken care of. I think some of the, its role, obviously, like all of our roles, changes over the years. But where the BBC is second to none is in terms of its ability to develop projects. I'm talking drama here because that's really the only one I know. Its ability to develop projects and provide opportunities, and that needs to be looked after. I think it's all about putting training, bringing back those screen skills initiatives, and potentially setting up development funding in areas outside of London in the nations and regions, and giving them to people who are committed to that nation and region to run, so that you can really see the benefit. I did this as a private individual with a public relationship. I would encourage everyone to do that, but I think there's more that in the public that they could do to help that too. Wales have been brilliant, there's no doubt about it. I think that Wales, seeing that there's, seeing the coal mining go, seeing the steel go, seeing some of the manufacturing factories, the jeans factories or whatever, shut down, they've really looked to the creative industries and thought, okay, what can we do here? We're just a small example of that. There could be more, and there could be more across all the nations and regions. When I talk about, I think sometimes the debate has got skewed when people have talked about we need to push more, not be so centralised. They've often talked about, we need to put an HQ in the nations and regions. Let's move this department out. Let's put Channel 4 somewhere. It's not that. Nobody cares where a small group of office people are. It's jobs. It's jobs for people. It's levelling up. It's kind of like let's get industry going here. I don't mind coming to London to meet the people who've got their hands on the money, as long as they let me spend it in the area that we need to in order to get the jobs going and opportunities through.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Alex.
Thank you, Caroline. I used to be on the Environmental Audit Committee. And as well as all the progressive things that you've talked about, Bad Wolf also operates in the circular economy. So how can the rest of the industry be incentivised to address the vast amount of waste that happens in the film and TV industry, and what particularly can be done for small independent production companies in this area?
I think again, it's about control over the space. Although I don't think that it should be relegated to that. I think if you are going to film on location somewhere, you've got to be ever more mindful of what your footprint is. But it does mean we can start within Wool Studio Wales good sort of custom and practice to what we're doing. I think the Albert scheme is something everyone should sign up to and everyone should take seriously. And then what we do is we let as many people, obviously everyone who's working within Bad Wolf HQ knows about it, but on our productions knows about what we're doing and become invested in it. So they have choices about what they do. So for example, I'm always really keen to have 2 meat-free days a week, for example, which saves in so many different ways. Haven't managed to make that happen yet. But I think we allow people to come forward and have a say in what they feel that they can, as individuals, contribute to help make things happen. And as a result, our studio and our productions have done well on that level. I think our industry is an industry and it's highly industrialised. At some point, it needs to be about more than electric charging points and paper cups and non-plastic and what we're eating and how we're clearing up, etc. At some point, it needs to be about proper use of green energy. But that's not my story. That is another story. But if we can boost that, then Bad Wolf and Wolf Studio Wales would use that, and so would the industry.
So on that energy, so it's a big user of energy, the film and TV industry.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Both in production and then particularly in streaming. There is a greening of streaming initiative. Is there anything in production to try and reduce energy use and move
we just all sorts of things. So having a studio means that, and building more in the studio means that you don't take the trucks out on the road so much. I am not across the use of energy in streaming, but I know that's huge. But I think certainly it's just about moving less. But you can't always do that for every production. Then it's a question of how you move. But it would be better if we can move in a greener way. But I can't get that's one I'm not likely to solve. But I would use if someone else solved it. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's something we need to work on. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Jane, can I thank you all, thank you on behalf of all of us for appearing here today, for all your time, all your answers, and for giving us so much to think about, some really useful info. If there's anything else you think about afterwards, please do drop us a note and we'll sort of add it into our inquiry as well. But thank you very much.
I really appreciate you taking the time to look at this and ask the questions, so thank you very much.
Great pleasure to see you. Thank you very much. Can I invite our next 3 panellists forward, please? It's
very good. The best people around. Huge campaign this year.
Quite a career.
Those questions are obviously my main. No, I know. Be very box tomorrow, don't we?
Okay, everybody happy?
Brilliant.
I'll rub it down with my pen. Hi. So our second panel today, we're going to be hearing from Andrew Wootton, OBE, from the British Film Commission, Neil Hatton from the UK Screen Alliance, and Andrew M. Smith, OBEDL, from Pinewood Group. I've got all your titles
there
here.
You go.
Andrew. Before I begin, I should put on the record that the committee were warmly welcomed to Pinewood Studios on a visit in February last year, and that I'm hoping to reschedule a planned visit to Shepperton Studios in the coming weeks. Thank you all of us sorry, I'm away with the ferries today, too much cold and flu medication. Thank you all of you for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to see you all, and we're really, really grateful for your time. Now I'm going to kick off the questions. We've heard about the appeal of British cruise locations, tax reliefs, and how they have made such a success of British film and high-end TV. But what are the other vital factors that inward investors are looking for, Andrew?
Well, thank you, Chairman. I think there's a number of factors. I mean, obviously we have some of the best crews in the world, and this committee's heard about that already. But the film and high-end television tax relief make the UK an attractive destination. And there is a report which the BFI produced called the Screen Economy Report, and I know the BFI I should declare an interest, and one of the governors of it, are giving evidence to this committee later on. But at a survey of producers, it said if the UK did not have those tax reliefs, production spend would reduce by 92%. 92%, and that's evidenced in this report. So the crews, the tax release, the infrastructure. We have some amazing studio facilities in the UK, and that's why you've seen, a little bit like Bad Wolf, you've now got Disney who have taken long-term agreements on every single stage at Pinewood, and that's including their subsidiaries of Lucasfilm and Marvel. Amazon have taken 9 stages at Shepperton on long-term agreements, and Netflix. Now you then look at that again at Shepperton. You then look at that with Warner Brothers at Leavesden and Sky Universal. These are the 4 biggest film and high-end television companies in the world who have made their long-term homes here in the UK. So this isn't production by production. This is actually their homes, which also provides a lot of additional indirect, direct and implied benefits by having their homes here now. So the UK, I think it was the Prime Minister said when he announced in the budget, the package for the creative industries, we are the second largest production hub outside of Hollywood.
Mm. Neil, from your perspective, what is it that attracts this investment?
Well, I think we, again, like Andrew says, we've got really good visual effects artists and crews in the UK. In fact, 4 of the largest visual effects companies in the world were founded in the UK and are headquartered here. But over the last few years, we've not been serviced that well by the tax credit because of the issue of the 80% restriction on the amount of spend that can be incentivised. So what's been happening is that people have been coming to the UK to film, and then once they've used their budget up to film, they get to the 80% cap and there's no more tax relief left. So off they go to other parts of the world to seek tax relief in other jurisdictions, particularly Canada is a very popular destination. So that's why we welcome the fact that this has been fixed, but certainly in part for TV and for high budget film was fixed in the spring budget, because giving VFX an exemption from that cap means that you can now get to the situation where if you film here, you can do your VFX here. Usually it's one or the other, very seldom both. So I think now we'll really see that that the UK is really world class, has been right from the beginning. We've got a long track record of winning the VFX Oscar. I think there was 8 years in a row when we won it for films like Gravity and Ex Machina is also a much smaller film that probably not as well known, but we certainly won the Oscar for that in the UK. So I think we've got the track record, we've got the people, now we've got the legislative environment coming to sort that out for us now, and I think we've got a very, very bright future.
You're a happier man this side of the budget and
Indeed.
recent. Okay,
much
good.
happier.
It's good to know. It's good to see you happy, Neil. Adrian, can I speak to you about European works? It comes up quite a lot in the evidence that we've taken so far. How significant is the potential risk of the UK losing European work status? What would it mean for us and our competitiveness?
I think that there's a lot of conversations going on about European works. I can't say that we at the British Film Commission are the policy leads on that. The British Film Institute are, and they're leading a strategy group involving the broadcasters and lots of other people looking at that issue. I think everyone said that if there was a change with the European government, with the European Commission, that could have some very negative influences in terms of actually the amount of potentially production that's made in the UK. But as I say, the British Film Institute is very much leading on the kind of strategic response to that. And as far as the British Film Commission is concerned, what we've been doing is acting in a kind of far more I guess, granular way, what we've been doing ever since Brexit is actually reaching out to our partners across Europe and forming a whole series of new relationships, a whole series of new agreements with, which started with Spain and Italy, and working with France and working with Austria and Norway and Malta, in order to basically say to our European partners, look, we are one of the largest production hubs in the world. An enormous amount of production bases itself in the UK and then goes out across Europe. It's in our mutual interest, though we're competitors, to work together and for there not to be barriers and blockages between productions moving across Europe. And as a result of the variety of MOUs that we've signed over since October 21, Spain changed its kind of working permits and visa systems, and a whole range of European countries have actually changed their tax relief credit systems to harmonise with the UK in order that we have a much more seamless relationship between those productions that are moving between territories but are based in the UK. And so that's been our kind of response, in a sense, to trying to ensure that we can actually work across Europe and our production partners can work across Europe on a very much granular level, whilst the discussions on European works continue on a kind of political and strategic level.
Has there been, it feels like you may not be the right person to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there anything that the government should be doing that would help you in your endeavours to kind of build those relationships with Europe?
I mean, I think that obviously it's a very, very complex thing, but I think that the work that the BFI is doing, which looks at the mutual benefit and the mutual benefit between ourselves and Europe for the UK being inside the quotas rather than outside the quotas, is something that I think the BFI would very much welcome the government being very actively engaged in that issue.
Did anyone have anything to add on that particular front before we move on?
No, I mean, I think as Adrian said, the BFI are really leading the charge on that one, which I think they're coming to see you in a few weeks' time.
Yes, let's hope so. They'll be here to see us. Clive.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming to give evidence to us. Sorry, no, I lost my place. Beg your pardon. How concerned are you that last year in investment for high-end TV fell from 51% to 46% this year, or in 2023? And what factors other than the US strikes are to blame, or were to blame?
I mean, I think a number of members of the committee met with the British Screen Forum last week, and there was a presentation which concluded that as a result that the content arms race has come to an end. And I think what you have now seen, and Adrian can give a bigger picture on this, is that the number of film and high television productions are going to probably fall back to a more normalised level. Again, if you look at some of the comments in the press by the likes of Bob Iger recently, he said, we're going to make less and focus more on quality. Paramount made a similar comment recently about improving return on investment by lowering the average cost per title, and others have made similar comments. So I think there's been a rebalancing and growth has normalised. But the good thing is, in the UK, by having permanent homes by the big US studios, if there is going to be less production, it's going to be made here.
And what I'd add to that is that I completely agree with what Andrew said, but I'd say two things. One is that you can't underestimate how, this is a once-in-a-century experience, the strike. I mean, it's not something that has happened in 65 years, and there are underlying shifts, that there is definitely a concentration, a shrinking, a consolidation. But as Andrew said, the long-term investment that the studios and streamers have made in the UK, the attractiveness that both Neil and Andrew have described, and I would add all the soft power about the English language, about acting talent, the acting talent base, not just the crew base in the UK, and the fact that we now have 7, not 1, we have 7 production clusters around the nations and regions. The fact that whole area has expanded massively in the nations and the regions over the last 10 years. I mean, Jane was talking about what's happening in Wales, but what's happened in Scotland, I think of something like a 58% increase in production between 2019 and 2021, and something like a 185% increase in inward investment in Scotland between 2019 and 2021. It's a phenomenal increase all over the UK nations and regions, not just London, the South East. The strike stopped us dead in our tracks. There's no two ways about that. And there were some underlying other slower causes, additional causes. But I was in Los Angeles 2.5 weeks ago with a delegation of the UK nations and regions where we were actually talking to all the studios and streamers. And what I was really encouraged about, and this was pre the announcement, the fantastically welcome announcements in the budget, but to a production company, both large scale and independent, everyone said that outside of North America, the place they most wanted to make content was in the UK, with UK talent, in the UK nations and the regions, working with UK studios, taking advantage of UK visual effects. And actually, a week later, we just made it much, much more competitive and attractive for them to do more with us than they would have been doing otherwise.
You say that the contraction is to be expected because people are looking to invest less but looking to profit more from doing less effectively. But if we were to look at other countries that attract inward investment, would we see a similar sort of drop?
I mean, the answer to that is unequivocally. Everywhere around the world that had large-scale inward investment production, it pretty much stopped during, the latter part of 2023. And I think it's fair to say, and again, because I have very close relationships with our European partners and our Canadian partners, we've gone back, even though it's slow, and 2024 is not going to be what the beginning of 2023 or 2022 is. It is starting to go back. There are major film and television starts happening on the studios of the UK nations and regions as we speak. And that will be further escalated by the changes that have been made in the budget. So, and that's not to underestimate also what's been said about Cruise. There's no two ways about it. Cruise has suffered terrible hardship, and we're not going to get back to those employment levels, in 3 or 4 months. That it is going to be an accumulation, but they will be going back to work because that work is coming in, and with the tax relief changes, we are going to be more competitive than we were actually just a few months ago. So I'm cautiously optimistic. It's not necessarily going to be at, say, 2022 levels, but nor do I think it's going to be going back to what we were in 2017 or 2016, because we are an incredibly competitive place to make high-end film and television, and we've put the measures in place to continue to be attractive in a ferociously competitive market where you hear a new tax relief announced every week in parts of Europe and other parts of the world, and we've put measures in place, I think, to combat that.
Would you say that we have the studio capacity to make the most of that demand?
Well, the British Film Commission for the last 3 years has been involved in a major exercise working with our colleagues at Pinewood and Leavesden, but not just that. We've increased studio space by nearly 40% in the nations and regions over the last 3 years. We went from a situation where in 2020 we had 3 million square feet of studio space. By 2025, that will have reached 6 million square feet of studio space, and not just concentrated all in London, the South East. Jane mentioned the studio developments in Wales, the additional studios that, Pyramids, Ward Park was there for a while, but there's a number of new studio spaces in Scotland, there's new studio spaces in Liverpool, the extension to the Bottle Yard in the South West, additional stages being built in Belfast Maritime Harbour. So the one thing I'm not worried about in that sense is studio capacity. We have the studio capacity to meet demand. What the UK and international industry is now working very hard on is to match the skills with that studio capacity. That's the key question. And I think that the industry is actually making a very sterling effort to try and match what's happened and what the British Film Commission, because we've been involved pretty much with every one of those studio developments across the whole of the UK nations and regions as part of our the additional support we were given by the British government to stimulate studio development. And now the challenge, I think, is about skills.
I think Adrian, I think if you'd asked that question 4 or 5 years ago, we would have said there's not enough capacity. And in fact, we would have evidenced feature films going to other jurisdictions because we didn't have the capacity. We now do have that capacity in the UK, not just around London, but in the nations and regions. And in fact, we've got planning permission at Pinewood to build another 25 stages. We're going to adopt a very cautious approach to that development because we want to see where the demand is going. But we've got certainly sufficient facilities throughout the UK, and there's many more coming on stream. We talked about the Bottle Yard; they're building 4 sound stages. Littlewoods in Liverpool. I mean, there's plenty of examples where we're seeing, and of course Sunderland, which was announced on Friday, which I think 17 purpose-built sound stages. So it is being spread. But it's the skills, I think.
So we're confident that we have space for to meet future demand.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. Could I just mention the fact that, of course, visual effects and post-production have suffered in exactly the same way as the production sector, except that we are delayed in the effect because of the position we are in the production cycle. You can't do visual effects until something's been shot. In a sense, our recovery is going to be after the recovery that happens in studios. Now, if I do have some regrets about what was announced in the budget, is that the visual effects tax relief doesn't actually come in until April 25, which means that we might see some people delaying their spend until that point. That's actually what we don't want to see. We want them to get spending now. We don't want them to have any excuse to delay, because a lot of the companies in visual effects are really suffering. During the COVID pandemic, there was something like, we estimated there were about 23% layoffs of the workforce in visual effects. That was very much lessened because we had furlough. We've had no furlough in the strike period, which means that the layoffs could reach 40%, and I think we're still not at the bottom of the bathtub curve yet. So there's still some way to go, and the sooner we get that VFX tax relief in and incentivise people to come and use our VFX studios, the better.
Just one last question from me. What will the strike by below-the-line workers in Hollywood mean for production here?
I think that's a very good question. We were asking that question in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago, and I think that there's a lot of caution in the US about that, and I think that they're making contingency plans, is what I would say. They're making contingency plans because they're very worried about stopping again, and whether they have to look at that production moving further offshore.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Alex.
Thank you. The committee recently went to France, and we met with quite a number of organisations, including CNC, and we talked about co-production and investment. Yesterday I was with Mayor Tracy Brabin, where we discussed about inward investment into West Yorkshire in creative industries, and we talked about other countries in the US, for instance, South Korea. So what portion of inward investment in the UK's film and high-end TV already comes from outside the US, and what's the potential to grow inward investment from outside the US, thinking about what you've just said?
The overwhelming majority of inward investment, just because of the size of the investment market and the Hollywood studio system, is the US, and that is unlikely to change in the near future. The British Film Institute, which we support very much and have been involved in these initiatives, is looking at emerging territories and how we can develop reciprocal relationships and stimulate further co-production. But co-production remains a very, economically speaking, and I have to speak from the PSC from an economic perspective, it remains a very small proportion of the total value of production spend in this country. I think that what I'm really encouraged by, particularly in terms of European co-production and other emerging territories, is that actually the confirmation of the new independent film tax credit, I think, offers a new opportunity, because those territories outside the US are likely to be spending smaller production budgets, and that's certainly true across mainland Europe. And I think the independent tax credit will stimulate opportunities for more co-production, which I think is very healthy. Also, those independent films will also be able to benefit from the variety of new production space and infrastructure across the nations and the regions, and also the additional incentives that the nations and the regions can offer independent film. So I think the independent film tax credit is very good for co-production and actually very good for further stimulation of the economies of the nations and the regions.
Do you think that sitting outside Creative Europe is a barrier to those co-productions?
I think that the British Film Institute's position, which we support, and I think we supported in the submission to you, is that it would be very positive with the government to consider rejoining Creative Europe, and I think that is the British Film Commission's position, supporting the BFI's position.
I think actually, if I'm right, Adrian, I think the UK actually got more out of it than what we paid into it. Yeah. So from an economic perspective, it seems a bit of a no-brainer. But
my organisation also represents animation, and that particular sector is very keen that we get back into Creative Europe.
It's like a no-brainer. Anyway, so my final question is inward investment by some of the major Hollywood studios and US platforms crowding out other investors and thus making us too reliant on US inward investment on a small number of companies. We know who they are.
I don't think that inward investment is crowding out other investors. I think actually, if you look at both content spend and actual bricks and mortar spend, inward investment has probably stimulated more investment, and certainly in terms of capital investment, and our experience working with new investors to come in to build studios around the UK, we have a new investment group essentially that came in that weren't in the UK before as a result of the certainties around the tax credit, the talent and the demand for our infrastructure to respond to more studio space. So, and I think actually, and I think again positively, there are a whole range of investors in the US who are making films in the up to £15 million range, but making them in different parts of the world. When now with the new independent film tax credit, they'll be very keen to work with British producers, British directors and British writers to make them in the UK. So I think that actually we'll probably find more US investment coming into the UK, but around independent film.
And I think Alex, the other thing is that we should see this as one industry. If you're a carpenter or wig maker or you're running a unit catering, whether it's a British independent film or a large Netflix film, it is being made in the UK, and that's where your jobs are. So I think it's not about one or the other. It's actually growing the pie, and I think certainly with the British independent, or sorry, the lower budget films, 1 to 15 million intervention in the budget, that's going to have a huge impact, positive impact, particularly in the nations and regions.
I think the independent film tax credit is very welcome, but in terms of visual effects and post-production, it still has the 80% cap restriction in it, which I think is unfortunate that was not thought about when it was introduced, because a £15 million budget film could easily have £500,000 worth of visual effects in it. So that is still at risk of flight from the UK to go and seek a tax credit elsewhere. Now, those kinds of budgets are very often serviced by the smaller boutique companies, the emerging companies, the ones that will grow. And also they tend to be in the regions as well. So I think we've kind of missed a trick by not having that exemption in the independent film tax credit.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Rupa.
Thanks. Yeah, mine are also for Adrian, pretty much. I just wondered, as Chief Executive of Film London, were you aware of a loophole I discovered the other day when I went to see a company in Acton? So that's within Greater London, but not Zone 1. It's one of these perverse unintended consequences things. So that they're called Pixie Pixel, and they hire out equipment to productions, sound equipment, cameras, that kind of thing. They supplied 2 series of an ITV detective show, Grace, that's set in Brighton. And then, because of all this levelling up stuff, the incentive is for people to do a regional production has to get their gear from regional companies. So despite the fact Brighton is nearer Acton, the series now has to get them from Manchester, and in terms of time and emissions, it's a long way round. I've raised this in the chamber and I've put it in writing to them, but surely there's a way of doing things based on not, companies that are within the M25 that aren't central London. They feel they have the worst of all worlds. And, you could do things based on distance and those kind of things. As Alex said, we're meant to be looking at net zero and all those carbon footprint things.
I mean, in terms of sustainability, I completely agree with you. I don't know that example, and I'm not aware of that loophole. I mean, I'm obviously aware of broadcast restrictions and what is limited, in and outside the M25, which has obviously been done to stimulate further production being taken out of London, the South East. But I'm not aware of that example. No.
I mean, that looks like something that if the nearest other supplier is in Manchester, it just seems. It's annoying for them because it takes them longer to receive the stuff.
Yeah, it does seem rather odd. I've not come across that before.
Right, I mean, I do feel as an outer London MP, and I think Clive is of the same opinion, that, sometimes London seems to assume the streets are paved with gold, Big Ben and all this, whereas we're in constituencies that have companies that need servicing that don't fit that brand, where the entire London was... every London borough was exempt from the Towns Fund, all those levelling up pots of money that saw other colleagues in a competitive fight scrambling for crumbs from the table. I don't like the concept particularly, and I think outer London gets it worse. I just wanted to flag that as a Film London person, maybe something, Adrian Wootton, you could help Clive and I champion. And I just wanted to ask, really following up from Alex's questions, do you know what proportion of inward investment in the UK's film and high-end TV comes from outside the US?
It's a very small percentage. I mean, as I say, I think it's something like 98% of inward investment is either US financed or US invested. Because, as I said earlier, the US is the only country actually in the world that has a studio system and that has that level of content financing within its own corporate structures, and pretty much there is no other country in the world that makes films and television programs of the volume, of the size, and of the budget size that the US. I mean, for example, India has a very high volume of production, and we benefit from that production. Bollywood films do shoot in the UK, but they're very, very, very low value in terms of, they're very rarely anything above, £1 million. And so, and most countries in the world, if you look at their actual production spend, it's very small. And the British Film Commission's mission, actually, in the way it was established, was precisely to attract that high-end film and then television in order to generate lots of revenue for UK PLC and more jobs. And that's still our emphasis and our focus.
What difference did Brexit make?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, what Brexit made, I think, for UK film and television is that it created some additional technical barriers between ourselves and European countries that were relating to whether the respective tax regimes, tax credit regimes were harmonised, and also about movement of people and movement of equipment, which is precisely why, not on a political level, but on a tactical level, we have been working with a whole range of European countries, and then we'll be signing more agreements with countries over the course of the next weeks and months in order to work very practically to get them to modify their regulations and make changes, which I have to say they've responded to very positively and have been doing. But certainly in terms of technicalities, it's been about the logistics more than anything else in terms of Brexit.
Thanks, Rupert. Damien?
Just a bit more detail, if I may, on VFX tax rates and so on. I get from what you said earlier that I'll ask, do you think that removing the 80% cap is, in principle, solving most of the problems?
If you hadn't moved the 80% cap, then nothing else would have worked.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you're capped out, you're 0%. regardless of what the headline rate would be. So I think the fact that we've moved from zero in many circumstances to almost 30% is a very positive step in solving that problem.
I mean, as you know, it's been consulted on and won't come in till 2025. So what do you hope comes out of the consultation?
The consultation in the next 10 weeks, we haven't seen the consultation questions yet.
Oh, right, okay.
But we hope we understand that is going to be talking about what costs are in scope. So the important thing here, and we recommended that the definition of what is visual effects should align with the BFI's cultural test definition, which has been very carefully tweaked to make sure that it's about creating additionality. The reason why was tweaked back in 2014, which was the last time that there was a major change to the tax credits around the lowering of the minimum spend threshold from 25% to 10%, was that in order to meet your cultural test requirement for visual effects, spending 80% of your visual effects in the UK and thereby getting 4 points in the cultural test, we had to ensure that we were looking at the UK vendor spend rather than the whole VFX spend. So we don't recommend incentivising the VFX spend that's done on set where the shooting takes place, because that's already here. If the shooting's here, the VFX spend on set is here. Yeah. It's the VFX spend in the vendors that we need to ensure is incentivised to stay here.
But it's further down the production chain, basically.
Well, that's the portable piece. It's not tied to where the shooting takes place.
Okay.
So therefore, you're just creating additionality.
And at the moment, you're waiting to see, as it were, what you're going to be asked in the consultation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, on the other side of it, Andrew, or Pinewood has warned in the past about basically fiddling with tax reliefs in an attempt, that will confuse international investment. Are you worried in this context about that?
No, not in this context. I mean, I think it's the US studios themselves have been looking for the visual effects issue to be addressed. I think in the past, particularly members of the EU, when we had to notify to the Commission, to DG Comp, that we had these in place, that always frightened the horses, quite frankly. So I think collectively we all caution about changing the tax reliefs, the audiovisual tax relief. They worked well. They're introduced by Dawn Primrolo and Gordon Brown, and they've been enhanced by successive chancellors. And you only have to look at the amount of money the private sector's as a result of the stability of the policy. So, for example, we've invested £750 million recently on building new stages, which has created 14,000 odd jobs and adding an additional 750 million of GVA to the economy. So there are other indirect and direct benefits of the film tax relief. But the other point I would make, it's not always about money. The great advantage of the UK's film tax relief and the audiovisual ones is that they're easy to understand. They have been in place for a long period of time. So you know up front if you're eligible, and the BFI does the certification for that. And that is a huge advantage. Of course, the UK always wants to be competitive, and we have to do that. But if you're not careful, if you keep increasing rates on relief, it's a race to the bottom. But we have to keep an eye on, because it is highly competitive internationally. But we're in a good place, and again, we're in a good place because demonstrated by the fact that the likes of Netflix and Amazon and Disney have their permanent homes here now.
And does that make a difference? Because there is, we've heard all through this inquiry about the potential, or indeed the actuality of an international arms race on tax credits. Is it the case that now particularly the big streamers are so embedded here that actually as long as we're stable, we can afford to some extent to sit out the arms race?
I think to some extent, yes. Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Only to a certain extent. I mean, we were a long way short in visual effects.
Yes, of course.
But as Andrew says, there are non-financial advantages that we have, English language being one, and the fact that we're darn good at it being another one. So I think it's where we are at the moment. I think it'll be a very interesting place when the tax relief comes in. What we really need to do is make sure we measure that.
Yeah.
Because when we made the changes back in 2014 that I just referred to earlier, that was not baselined, and we have no idea how effective or ineffective that actually was. So I think it's really important that the BFI and HMRC collect the data at source from the VFX tax credit when it comes in, and report on it regularly in the quarterly statistics that the BFI produce, and then we can see how well it's doing.
I think the other point to add, if I may, Damien, is that it is incumbent upon us and our sector to demonstrate to the UK taxpayer and the Treasury that the Treasury is getting a good financial return. So looking at the BFI's Green Economy Report, which is, I think, in its 8th edition now, forwarded by the Chancellor and checked by Treasury economists. So the Treasury gets a strong return. So for £1 of film tax relief that is paid out, £8.30 come back in GVA. And that's an impressive figure. But we're not complacent, and as I say, the BFI take the lead on this. We all input into it, and we have it break down for visual effects, children's television programmes, and so on.
Yeah, we built whole railways on much less better rates of return.
Absolutely.
I remember it well. Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to turn to everyone's favourite subject, business rates. We heard the Chancellor's announcements of 40% business rates relief for 10 years. After the rises we saw recently, I think my question's to Adrian and Andrew. Does that fully solve the challenge of those rises? And as Adrian's a fellow Wolverinian, I'll come to you first.
Jen, I think that the budget announcement was incredibly important because without it, the impact on studios, particularly in England, would have been devastating, to be honest, because the increase in rates, was literally hundreds of percent from the smallest to the largest stages. Obviously, Northern Ireland and Scotland are exempt because they are devolved, and those rises of the VOA were not applicable to them. They were applicable to England and Wales. And frankly, the British Film Commission, as Andrew knows, has been working for 18 months with the VOA on this. And I think that, as I say, it's incredibly welcome, but I have to say it's an incredibly welcome sticking plaster. A 10-year sticking plaster and a very big chunk of money, but the underlying issue of the rate increases is still not resolved, and it's not resolved for Wales. In fact, we've agreed to use our resources to pay for the rates specialist who's been working with us on our working group to work with the Welsh Government on providing advice and support for their formulation to respond back on the fact that they didn't get the mitigation. But we are going to carry on working with the Studios Working Group, and we are going to carry on liaising with the VOA because there will be another one of these exercises coming down the road in the not too distant future to see how we can work out a long-term solution, because 10 years sounds like a long time. It's a minimum in terms of investment, but it's not a long-term solution. So I would say from a BFC's point of view, and assuming we secure our own funding for the next few years, we think we're going to be working on this for some time to come.
Thank you. And the relief doesn't apply to new studios developments.
It does apply to new studios and existing studios, but it's quite a complicated methodology. I won't go into it now, but it's quite a complicated methodology about how it applies differently to different studios.
Yeah. So I mean, there's various categories,
yes,
from
exactly
warehouses to warehouses with improvements to our facilities purpose built. I mean, I think in the trade press. Just to give an example of the impact, Warner Brothers rates were going up, I think according to Deadline, 5 times to 25.3 million. In the case of Pinewood, again, it was in Deadline, so it's in the public domain, 4 times to 16.2 million. Now, if that had not been corrected, you would have seen, as has already been announced by one studio, they were not going to invest in the UK. So this, and tribute to the BFC, and we had a lot of support on getting this through, but it's now incumbent on us to work with the Valuation Office to get a solution. I think, very interestingly, because it's an arm's length body, it's very difficult to influence, quite rightly so. And unlike Ofcom, which takes in investment into consideration on decisions, the valuation doesn't.
It doesn't.
So I think there's something there which... but we're delighted with the intervention by the government, and we look forward to working with the Valuation Office in the coming week. In fact, I don't think we've even seen the actual report yet.
Yeah, we're waiting on the final VOA report. But Andrew's right, and obviously the British Film Commission is supporting Wales as much as it can in terms of them finding an appropriate solution. But there is definitely still more work to be done, because if the mitigation hadn't have been very welcomely introduced by the government, we wouldn't have just seen us being uncompetitive. We would have actually seen studios, particularly in the nations and the regions, close. And that has mitigated against that, and that's fantastic, whether it's for the Bottle Yard or studios in Manchester or wherever it might be, or in Yorkshire. But as I say, there is still a lot more to be done.
Thank you. And the stage space support and development initiative, is that, it runs out, I think, the end of next year. Is that still having a good effect? Is it still relevant, or does it sort of tie into all of this?
Well, the stage space development funding we received was actually for two purposes. It was both to help stimulate studio development where we needed the space, as we've talked about, across the whole of the nations and the regions, not just London and the South East, and it's been very effective in doing that. But it was also to provide the British Film Commission with resilience in order that we could still carry on supporting all of the activities. And we are now currently beginning a process of trying to renew our funding in terms of, because although Andrew and I have talked about this, although we're not now in a process of trying to stimulate any new, particularly new studio funding above and beyond studio development, above and beyond what has already been announced, because we want to see how that stage space that's been built or is being built around the whole of the nations and the regions matches with the demand as it comes through. There's still an enormous amount of work to do. Lots of those studios are in construction, they're in planning, they need our support and advice. We're working with them on sustainability for their construction, we're working with them on business rates. So we are making an argument to the government that we want to try and find a long-term funding settlement for the British Film Commission, and actually had a tremendous amount of support, I have to say, from the Department of Culture and Media and Sport on this, and we are currently working with the Department of Culture and Media and Sport to make a case for that funding continuing on a multi-year level, so that we can provide the service that we need to the industry.
Thank you. And anything to add before I go on to a curveball question? Andrew, do you...
No, I think...
Okay. I'm just wondering, with the expansion about skills, it keeps coming back and it keeps being mentioned. What's the solution for...
Well, I would say, I mean, Jane gave fantastic example, and we're big fans of everything that Bad Wolf and the Welsh Government has done in Wales, and Screen Alliance Wales is a really fantastic model. But I would say, and it's not to disagree with Jane, but Wales isn't the only example of the fantastic work that's going on in the nations and the regions in terms of skills. What has happened is two things. I mean, one was there was a BFI skills review that led to a national task force harnessing all levels of the industry, which I am still on that task force, working to rework with Screen Skills about how they deliver a national strategy backed by private business industry investment into skills for the whole of the industry. And whilst that's going on, the BFI also spent its lottery money creating a new series of screen clusters for skills, and there are currently 6 of them. They are expanding further. There is one for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the North, the Midlands, and there are others coming. And that's a massive new on-the-ground granular initiative to provide new entry training with very much a focus on diversity and inclusion, which again Jane was talking very much about. So I do think that the UK is, and actually talking to my European colleagues and talking to our friends in the States, I think the UK is doing more on skills than any other film producing country in the world. There's a lot to be done because we have a lot of skills we need, and if we do start to escalate in terms of production again, and we do find the positive impact of things like whether it's the visual effects tax credit or the independent film tax credit, we're going to have more and more need for young people. I think the last estimate was we needed something like 21,000 new people to enter the industry in the next 5 years. That will grow again. So it's really important that these initiatives that have been announced work. But I have to say, cautiously optimistic, I think we are doing a lot, and it's not just Wales, but you know what the fantastic work that Screen Scotland's been doing, and Screen Scotland's running one of the skills clusters, what's happening with Northern Ireland Screen, what's happening with Birmingham Create, the Northern Alliance that is another one of the clusters, and there's a London Metro Skills cluster for the studios as well. There's a lot happening. It hasn't solved it yet because these things take time, and you can't train people as fast as you can build studios, but there's a lot of really positive work going on.
I think one of the initiatives, Joe, that we're doing is called Set for More Futures Festival. So this year will be the third year we've done it. So this is 4,000 young people coming down, not just locally to where Pinewood and Shepperton are, but all over the UK. We prioritise the 12 government opportunity areas where education is struggling. In some cases, we put on buses to bring the kids down. And then we open it up to other colleges. So I think, Janie, if I'm right, you've got I'm just looking at my notes here. Wolverhampton Screen School and AAT Trust came down, and I think, Julie, we had Sunderland College come down. So we're opening this up to the nations and regions as well. And over 2 days, they get to see all the different jobs behind the camera. And we encourage parents and carers and guardians to come, because there's an education with parents, because quite frankly, there are some parents who don't think this is a real job. So we bring those in, and there's also an element of retraining as well. But the sector's doing a lot, but we've got to get this right. We keep talking about it.
Thank you.
The visual effects skills are also very important here. I mean, we estimate the changes will create another 2,000 jobs in the visual effects industry, plus about another 800 in the supply chain. Now, visual effects jobs are very highly digital, and traditionally they have been taken by graduates, but we do have an apprenticeships route as well, which we were building up until COVID. We lost the momentum when COVID happened for obvious reasons. But unlike the rest of the film industry, we are much more geared towards long-term employment, very often on PAYE terms, not freelance.
I was going to say I'm stealing someone else's area here, but
you're in danger of trampling all over Julie's toes here. We might move on that very note.
Exactly. So apologies, Julie, but straight into skills.
Before we do, can I just we've heard about Wolverhampton and Sunderland. Can we please invite St Vincent College and Gosport?
Well, we will certainly invite. And you're all very well to come.
To be entirely parochial.
It's about the only time of year I can get my colleagues volunteer to work on a Saturday, because it's such good fun.
New James Bond set in Wolverhampton, that would also.
Getting all of our bids in for training. I want to go back because you have covered some of what I wanted to ask about. Adrian, you have talked about trying to match the skills to all these studios being built, and the Sunderland studios were announced long before last Friday.
Yeah, sure.
There was just a high-profile secret visit last Friday, but there we go. So there's lots happening, and you've described lots happening. I know there's a lot happening in my area, and this is a regional thing, not just the studios are going to be in Sunderland, but it's very much a regional thing. But do you think it's time where we need a national strategy to pull all this together? Because there's lots of things happening, but I'm not sure it's all very linked up. And this is quite a mobile type of workforce, isn't it?
It is a mobile workforce, but the encouraging thing from my point of view is I mentioned, I think earlier, we now have 7 different established production clusters in the UK nations and regions with, and we call it a cluster when it has infrastructure and it has an established crew base. But there's others that are developing. North East Sunderland is developing, Birmingham is developing, and that's on top of the 7 that I've already mentioned, I absolutely agree with you, particularly about skills initiatives, about being joined up. And what I'm encouraged about, and this, cup, lip, slip, and the proof will be in the pudding. But the BFI skills clusters are just starting to operate, and North East is very much part of them. The North East, the Northern Alliance has got a cluster. Those clusters are all talking to each other, coordinated by the BFI. Those clusters are also talking very closely now with the employers that were brought together under the National Skills Task Force. And my hope is that these fragmented initiatives that have been fragmented are actually going to start getting knitted together, and that what we have is a concerted effort to drive skills, to drive inclusion and diversity and new opportunities that are all over the UK nations and regions, not just in London and the South East. And I have to say that, again, I don't think I'm looking at this through rose-tinted glasses, but I've been working in this industry a very, very long time. I've never seen an initiative on that scale with so many things happening nationally and regionally, and where people are actually talking to each other because they all realise that the prize is, there's ferocious competition out there, as we've mentioned. There's lots and lots of people that want to eat the UK's lunch on inward investment. And we've put ourselves in a fantastically competitive position because of our infrastructure, because of our tax reliefs, because of our talent. But it's in our hands. It's in our hands to lose that work, and the biggest factor won't now be our tax reliefs, it won't be our studio space, it's whether we have the people to do it. And so this initiative is...
Which is why I think is the need for a national strategy rather than this ad hoc approach of clusters. And yes, they're talking to each other, but there's nobody actually centrally pulling it all together, is there?
Well, the BFI is funding all of those clusters, and the BFI is coordinating those clusters, and the BFI is working with Screen Skills and the task force. So there is some knitting to be done. Julie, I wouldn't in any sense say it's all formed and nicely baked and ready, but it's only just started. I mean, literally, the clusters have only just started operating.
But I think you do make a very good point, because this is an oversaturated area of people doing bits and pieces on skills and training, and I think now we've got the cluster approach. Time will sell, but historically, there's so many organisations doing bits and pieces. And then, you've got LEPs, you had combined authorities, you've got elected mayors, you've got the BFI, Screen Skills. There's lots of different other bodies doing. So hopefully, this is now bringing it together.
I agree, but the only other thing I was going to say, and I don't know whether it'll come up anyway, is that people have asked about what could the government do more. The one single thing that I think we all feel in the industry, and this is not the first time you've heard it, not going to be the last, is change the apprenticeship levy. Because the apprenticeship levy is not fit for purpose, it's not useful for our industry, and it would make a massive difference if that was further revised. That's the one area that I think we all feel in the industry would have a massively positive effect if there was more flexibility in the apprenticeship levy.
So, Neil, I'm going back to what you started to talk about before, about given that post-production workforce is predominantly a pay-as-you-earn workforce. What's that meant for retention of staff during the strikes? Has it helped? Has it not? It
certainly helped during the COVID period because they got furlough. I think it has helped keep some of them in this period. But I mean, essentially, if you've not got no work coming in, you've got no turnover, you can't afford the payroll. So the problem is if you try and retain those staff, then you're probably going to go bust. So unfortunately, that's a harsh economic reality for them.
And if there was a new industry training fund for post-production employees set up, would there be an appetite for that among the industry? And
Almost
who would
certainly
set it up?
Well, there's something that we've proposed from the UK Screen Alliance, and we're in talks with various stakeholders about it now. I do think there is a case for it right now because of the introduction of the VFX tax relief, that those people who benefit from the VFX tax relief, the production companies and the rights holders who get the long-term benefit from that, should put a percentage of what they get from the tax credit back into training.
And who would set it up? Who would coordinate that?
Well, it could be. Well, it'd be the industry. We'd probably be very central to that. But we would look to people who've got expertise in that area. Maybe Screen Skills. They have a track record of managing these kinds of funds. So definitely, and certainly, we're already having talks about how that might work. But I think to the point that you were making about it being joined up and a proper strategy. I want to just talk about something which actually happens in your area, because you've got 3 colleges in your area. You've got Middlesbrough College, Sunderland College and Hartlepool Sixth Form College, all in the North East, who are part of the Next Gen Skills Academy network. And I want to kind of highlight that. About 10 years ago, a group of employers took on the recommendations that came from a report written by Alex Hope and Ian Livingston, which was called the Next Gen Report, which highlighted the fact that the education system was not teaching the right blend of skills that we needed, particularly in not just in visual effects, but also in games and animation and the whole of the 3D visualization sector. And that being maths and physics, art and coding. It's a very strange mix, but that's the right mix for us. And so we set up a qualification at level 3, 16 to 18, and then also set up this national network of colleges. So there's 3 in your particular region, but there are something, I think 14 or 15 across England, just been extended to Northern Ireland as well. So now we have something like 750 people on the programme, moving to 900 within the next couple of years. And it's a level 3 qualification. It's very good outcomes, employer-led, very much employer engagement involved in that, except it's not a T level. And by 2026, the DFE are threatening to defund it. A successful programme, a really important part of our pipeline, leads into apprenticeships, increases diversity, puts the skills in the regions, but yet it could be trashed by the defunding programme on level 3 to clear the way for the T levels. There is no visual effects T level. There can't be. Because to build a T level, you need to have an occupational standard at level 3. Our occupational standards are written at level 4 because that's where the skill level starts in our industry. So we can't build a T level because we're not allowed to. So here we have...
On the record, shall we say?
We have a dilemma here.
Thank you very much. And finally, just before the credits roll, John.
Hi, thank you very much, and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Just before we finish, maybe we could just do a quick down the table, because we as MPs often get contacted by people who have requests or wish lists. So can I ask you, first of all, Mr. Smith, what would be your wish list? What would you like the government and indeed local authorities to do to support inward investment in taking production from down south to the nations and indeed the English regions? In brief, what do you think your top wish list would be?
I think you're already seeing this naturally because of these new developments on studios. So there has been talk in the past about some enhancements on the film tax relief, maybe for regional funding or diversity. But I think, again, you asked that question 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been probably a very different answer. But you are seeing now major studio initiatives in the nations and regions. So I think it's happening.
Right. You talked about tax relief. That's obviously something central government can do. So specifically, what tax relief would you like to see and what effect would it have?
I would keep the existing reliefs as they are, lock it away in the file. And I think we had the Labour Party announced their creative interventions last week in London, and again they welcomed the recent things in the budget. So they're working, and I think they're working well.
Okay, that's clear. Mr. Hatton, a number of folk have approached me and asked me about VFX businesses specifically, and they've asked what would encourage them to invest outside London to other parts of the UK rather than, for example, expand overseas.
In our original proposal, we recommended a 5% uplift for VFX work outside of the Metro London area. I think that would have put rocket boosters under that inward investment. The Treasury decided not to go with that.
Why was that? What did they tell you?
I think they felt it was complex and difficult to audit. We could have put in technology solutions around that to help with that.
And they said that to you specifically, did they?
Well, yeah, when we prompted them to say that, and they said it was complex. That was the reason they told us that they weren't going to go forward with that. But I think, even though we haven't got that, I still think there's a big opportunity to invest in the regions. We know there are skills bases.
Regions
and the nations.
And the nations as
yes.
well.
There are skills bases around in the clusters that Adrian has mentioned. I have a member company that is in Glasgow. He says to me he craves a large competitor in Glasgow, partly because when he crews up, he brings people from south of the border, does the production, and then they go back. If there was a cluster in the central belt of Scotland, then they would be more likely to build those skills locally and people to stay there.
That's interesting. So there's a skill shortage.
Well, I think you
obviously if you have to bring people from England.
That's because the ebb and flow of production. You're not fully crewed all the time because it will depend on how many productions you've got on at any one time. And so you bring in people, not just from south of the border, but we used to bring people in from Europe. It's very much more difficult now. Freedom of movement is finished.
Well, why would that be?
In bringing people from Europe?
Yes.
Well, because they now require a visa.
Mm.
Yeah.
Which is yet more Brexit chaos.
It's not been helpful.
When you ask the government about this, the UK government about this, and this is a recurring theme we've heard for years, before the committee, they told us that once they negotiated this dream Brexit deal, they would solve this issue. What's been your experience post-Brexit deal with getting people from the European Union here? Why hasn't this issue been resolved?
Well, first of all, I want to say we are fully committed to building a domestic UK workforce, and we're putting in lots of educational interventions in order to do that. But, you know, our workforce in VFX was probably around 33% from outside of the UK, mostly from Europe. But that has reduced now to around 25%. Some of that was exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, where they went home and didn't come back. So, but, you know, it is ever more difficult to bring in exceptional talent and emerging talent from the rest of the world because of the high visa costs.
Out of interest, what does a visa cost?
If you wanted to relocate a high-value VFX supervisor, say from Canada, with their family, it's probably going to cost you about $20,000 in visa costs and all the other ancillary costs.
And if you were bringing the same person from Paris or Madrid?
Similar. It's the same.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Finally, Mr. Wootton, could I say that I'm quite intrigued by the dual roles that you hold, because you're both the CEO of the British Film Commission, but you're also the CEO of Film London. Is that correct? That must be very hard for you to combine those two roles, because if you succeed in bringing somebody to Sunderland, for example, you failed to get them to London. So you've presumably failed in your job as CEO of Film London. They've gone elsewhere.
I don't see it like that at all, actually.
You might not, but I bet that your colleagues in London do. And equally, if you get somebody to go to London, or you get a production to go to London, and they're not going to Sunderland or Sutherland, then clearly Sunderland or Sutherland have missed out. How can you possibly represent two completely different and competing areas?
Well, what I can say is that in terms of the way in which the structure was set up, obviously that was a decision of the UK government back in 2017 when the UK Film Council was dissolved, and we were asked to take on these responsibilities. I think that what I have to say is that we have completely separate teams with Chinese walls between those teams.
But you're the boss.
Yeah, I am the boss. That's absolutely true.
Says.
But I don't make the decision, and I don't encourage any film company to go to Sunderland versus London versus basically what we do, the British Film Commission does without fear or favour, is offer choice. We provide an inquiry service, we spread that around to the whole of the UK, and the film company decides where they're going. The television company decides where we're going. We don't decide where they're going. What we provide is objective promotion and support of the whole of the UK nations and regions. That's my job to do that. And yes, I run a team that provides the production services in London, but I am not involved in saying it should go to London, it should go to Wales.
Part of your job must inevitably involve lobbying and representing. It must. How could it? As
the chief executive of the British Film Commission, which is how I'm sitting here today, very unequivocally sitting here today, it involves lobbying on behalf of the UK nations and regions. I said 2 weeks ago, I was part of a delegation that took out Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the English regions to talk to all of the studios and streamers, where each of those nations and regions talked about what their particular area offered and why they should potentially consider.
That. It just seems and I know you're not responsible for it because, as you say, it was the UK government that set it up. It just seems a very weird combination of rules, because if somebody says to you, so what do you think, Mr. Wootton? Should I go to London or should I go to Liverpool or Leith? You would have to say, well, I can't possibly tell you that because I've got this dual role of being the high heechin of both London and the Britain overall.
No, what I was saying, Mr.
Inevitably, that's a competition.
No, it's not. If you look, actually, because if you ask me whether that happens or has happened, then what I will say is you have to go back to the data. You have to go back to the empirical evidence of what the British Film Commission does, what I've said, what the British Film Commission team does, and look at what we've done over the last 10 years. And there is no evidence, as far as I know, any data whatsoever, that we have been biased towards any territory in that sense. We are, but in fact, if anything, my team has spent more of their time promoting the UK as a whole because of the development opportunities, whether it's with stage space, whether it's skills that we've talked about, whether it's with sustainability, whether it's any of these particular things, is that if you look at the time that the British Film Commission has operated under these new tax credits and the work that we've done, I think we've been involved in 75% of all of film production activity that's gone out around the UK nations and regions. I mentioned the work that we've done to stimulate stage space and worked with, whether it's Screen Scotland or whether it's Wales, on all of those new stage space developments. So I think we've been able to operate and I've been able to operate in a completely fair and objective manner, not in a namby-pamby manner. It's actually making the film companies and the television companies have the choice based on the information that we have and the incredibly close partnership we have with the nations and the regions.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That brings us to a conclusion today. So thank you all so much for your time. If there is any other evidence or comments or thoughts that you come up with after the event, please do.
And Chair, can I just say on behalf, we are extremely fortunate to have such a huge support for our sector from not just this committee, from Parliament and Government. And there are other sectors of the UK of currently look at us very enviously. We don't take it for granted, but thank you very much for your support over the years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to see us today with all your evidence. We're really grateful. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.